In the last video, we created our user model, so our custom user model, rather than make use of the user model that ships with Django. We also created our user manager, which will allow us to, or has allowed us to create our super user via the Django CLI. Now in this video, as promised, we're going to create our endpoints, our API for allowing a individual or user to register to our API and to also log in and authenticate themselves. And this will be done again only in our user directory. We'll also be making use of data classes to map our requests, our request bodies to Python data classes rather than make use of Python dictionaries, which is a interesting way to kind of build, and also very easy, makes it a lot easier as a developer to build your APIs. Now, before I go into any more detail, let's go ahead and crack on with the code. So the first thing I'm going to do is just do a bit of housekeeping. With our views.py file just over here in the file explorer, I'm going to rename this to API, which is, or APIs, actually API is better. APIs, sorry, so to APIs. This is, so it's a bit more appropriate for what we're going to do here. And also create two new files, the first one being our serializer.py file. And I'm just going to turn this off. And finally, the services file, and this is just so we can keep things in a more organized manner. Okay, so the first thing is to actually create our serializer, and to do that, we first need to make the necessary import from REST framework. So we can say from REST framework, import serializers. And then here we can say class user serializer and serializers.serializer. And let's set all the fields. So we'll have an ID, and we can look at our user model. So it doesn't show it here, but our user also has an ID, and we need to include that here. So we'll say serializers.integer field as it's a number. It's going to be read only because we don't want the user or anyone to be able to change an ID via the API. We'll have first name, which is serializers.char field. I'm just going to copy this 2 more times, and we'll have the last name and the email. And then finally, we'll have the password, which again will be serializer.char field. However, this will only be a write only, as we don't ever want to return the password in an API response. Okay, so that's our serializer for now. Now in our APIs, we can go ahead and create our register endpoint. So to do that, let's first just delete all of this, and we can go ahead and import from REST framework views, response, exceptions. So these are the inputs that we will need as well later on, permissions. We also need our serializer, so import serializer, and we'll call this as user serializer. Actually import serializer as is, and then class register API. So this will be our register endpoint. We'll say views.api view. This will inherit from the API view that ships with the REST framework. And this will only have a post, only allow for a post request, not a get, update, a put, or delete. As register, we will just be sending the information to register a user, and it will just do just that. So we'll say serializer equals, actually, we should actually rename this. So import serializer as user serializer, and say here user serializer dot user serializer. We'll say data equals request dot data. Then we'll check to see if it's valid, and if it's not, we want to raise an exception. Then finally, we'll say data equals validated, or serializer dot validated data. And for now, let's just print it out. So we'll say print data, and we'll just return a response of, we'll just throw in a dictionary for now. We'll just say hello world. So nothing fancy, but the main point is just to print out the data that we get from this post. Now we need to attach this to our app, so to our URLs. The last file I'm going to create inside user is our URLs file. So URLs, and there what we need to do is first import from Django .urls, import path, and then and we can just import APIs, and we'll say URL patterns, and we'll say path, say register / and then APIs dot register API dot as view, and we'll just give it a name as register. Okay, and then finally, inside our core directory and inside core, go to URLs again. So not the same URLs file that we just changed or that we just added, the one that exists in our core folder. We need to include that here as well. So there, all you need to do is first import the include from Django URLs. So just on line 2, and then down below, say path, and then API / we'll say include, and then user.urls. Okay. Now, if you followed along from last video, well, what we ended up doing is just we made the migration, so it should work fine now. We just need to go inside API and then run our server. So Python manage run server. And we get an error because no module named APIs. And that is here. So we can say from imports APIs. And I think I made the same mistake in the APIs file. So say from imports serializer, and we'll set that as serializer like so, and it should be running. So sorry about that, and if you caught that, then congrats. Like, I always mess up when it comes to Python imports. I always forget how to write them, but now we have the server running, so you can see down here. Let's go ahead and open it up in your browser, and this is way too zoomed in. So you should see something like this. It makes sense because we don't have anything at our root URL. And then if you go / API and then / register, you'll see this here. So we have our register API. What we want to do now is actually just click post for no reason with no input in the content, and you'll get this. So it's expecting a first name, last name, email, and password. It's not expecting an ID, as the ID is read only, so it's only expecting these 4. So let's go ahead and fill that in. So inside content, make sure you put this in double quotes, so the first one being first name, and we'll set this as John. We'll have a last name, again in double quotes, otherwise you'll get an error. Say Doe. The email, which is john@gmail.com, which should be in double quotes. I don't know why I missed that. And then the password, which we'll set to hello awesome world. I'm just going to actually keep all this in a separate file just so I don't lose it. So let me, inside API, create a new file. I'll just call this data, and we'll just throw it in here just so we don't lose it. Okay, so let's go ahead and post this, and we get back our message, hello world, but what we want to see is our output. So if you look here in your command line, you should see something like this. Whoops. The ordered dictionary, first name, last name, email, and password, which is nice. This is exactly what we want. However, in terms of formatting or the way in which it's stored in a dictionary, which can be unpleasant if you have a rather complex API. So what we can do is actually create a Python data class and store that and map this ordered dictionary to that. So we have this serializer. It's taking in our data, it's mapping first name to first name, as we see here. It's doing last name, email, and password, and it's storing it as a dictionary. So if we could actually do something like print data and then first name, and we would get John, and we could do the same with last name, email, and password. However, we have to access it using these square brackets and then using a dictionary key, which can lead to errors in along like if you were to develop this into an application, as you know, sometimes making a string error can lead to all sorts of consequences, and it doesn't offer any kind of hinting. So what we can do to prevent that is in our services.py file, we can create a user data class which we can map this dictionary to. Now, I've repeated that a few times, but just to kind of solidify it or what we're trying to achieve. So inside services.py, let's go ahead and import data classes. And what we can say is dataclasses.dataclass as our decorator, and then class user data class. Now we want the first name. We need to give it a type, which is a string. We have the last name, which is a string as well. We have the email, which is a string. Password, which is also a string. And the ID, which is an integer. Now we need to set the ID to none, because when we're creating it, we will not be giving it an ID, as ID is only created upon creation. And the password, we won't always return it, so we'll set this to default of none. Okay, just below that, let's create a class method, and we'll say from instance, and this will come into play a bit later, but we'll say user, which will take in the user model. So we'll use this from instance to do the opposite when we will map a model object to our data class. And to add some extra typing, you can say from typing import type checking. You can say if type checking, then from the directory import user or model, dot user. Now here we can just add user like so, and this will return our user data class. And now, from models import user. I think that should work. And then just below this, we can say return CLS first name equals user dot first name, last name equals user dot last name, the email user dot email, and the ID, because when we do our from instance, the object will be retrieving an object and then throwing it into our data class. But if you are confused, then just bear with me. This will all make sense in a second. Okay, so we have our user data class now, and we can use this to map our request body. So inside our user serializer, what we can now say is we can override the to internal value. So we can say to internal value, say data, and then make a super call to internal value and pass in the data. And then we can say we just first need to import from services. So from import services. So return services dot user data class, and we can just unpack the data like so. Okay, so that's, if you remember from before, we had our ordered dictionary. Let's go ahead now and try the same again. So I'm just going to copy this input and back here, I'm going to paste it, post, and we get a lovely error. That's because I need to delete this thing here as it's no longer a dictionary. So let's try that again. Post, we get hello world, so everything worked out. But now you can see that we have a user data class, first name, last name, all that just like we had before. However, in this case, we don't have a dictionary, but rather a class, which is nice because now we can do something like data dot first name rather than do something like that, which is error prone. So yeah, it has its benefits. It also just makes readability a lot better. But yeah, you can of course use a dictionary if you feel like it, but this data class is something I definitely prefer. And okay, so finally we have our register API. Now let's actually add some real functionality to it. So what we need to say is we have the data. The next thing is to actually create a user out of it. So to do that, let's go into our services file and we'll create a function that will allow us to create a user. So we'll say create underscore user, say user, and this will take in our user data class and it will return our user data class. So instead of returning the object from the model itself, we'll use this kind of middleman to map it to. All right, so first thing is to get our instance. So we'll say we need to import models. So from, let me just organize this a bit better. So import models, and we'll say models dot user, and let's throw in the first name, which is user dot first name, last name, which is user dot last name, and the email, which is user dot email. Okay, we haven't used the password yet as we need to set that on its own. So we'll say if user dot password is not none, we'll do instance dot set password and we'll throw in user dot password. So remember this user right now, actually let's name it something a bit more appropriate. So user underscore DC, so user underscore data class. We can access the password that they sent in the request. So user underscore DC underscore DC, and this sets our password. Finally, we can save it to our database. So we'll say instance.save, and then finally return the user.data class, and then from model instance. So instead of like creating an object from scratch, we have this like helper function here, our class method, and we can just pass in the user model or the user model object. We'll say that it is just the instance. Okay, so this is our create user. Now let's go ahead and try this out once again. So in our APIs, we actually need to make that call, otherwise it's not going to do anything. So let's go ahead and import services inside our APIs file. And just below data.validated data, we'll say serializer.instance equals services dot create user, and we'll pass in user as our data. Okay, let's give this a shot. So I'm just going to copy this again, go back here, post, and we still get the hello world because we didn't return it, but we can, if we go to the admin, and if I remember the login, we can go over to users, and we see that now we have two users. So first one being our admin, the second one being the one that we just added, so John at Gmail, so John Doe, which we've just created a standard user, doesn't have staff status or super user status, with the email and the hashed password. So that's working fine now. What we can do though is in our APIs file, we can just, instead of returning this hello world, we'll say serializer.data. And now if we actually try this again, so I'm just going to copy this and of course not use the same data, otherwise we'll get an error. Actually, we can try it out with register. If we try this again, we should get an error and we get this unique constraint failed. This you can obviously handle if you want, and it's actually, if you were to create a proper API out of this, you would, but for now, let's just keep it simple. We'll say this is and post this, and we get back ID 3, which we didn't post, is created and then sent back to us, the first name, last name, and email, and not the password, because we never want to return the password. Okay, so that's our register API. The next one is to do the login API. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump back into the APIs file. And let's create a new class. This is going to be the login API. So login API. And this will again inherit from API view. And this will just be a post as well. So post, like so. Okay, the first thing is that we are not going to make use of our data class object that we created, so the one here, because we don't want to return a user object. We want to authenticate the user and then store that user session inside a cookie. So that way the validation and authentication is always done in the backend. In previous videos that I've done with Fast API, we did JWT tokens, which we stored locally in local storage. In this one, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to just store our session, our user authentication session, inside a cookie. So we'll say email equals request.data, and we want the email. We'll also take the password, which is data and then password. We'll also have now get our user based on that email. So we'll say inside our services.py file, let's create a new function. We'll call this user email selector. So get a user based on the email. We'll pass in a email. This will return a user. And we can just do user equals models.user.objects.filter, and then email equals email.first. We could do get, however, that would just result in a hard error. If you want to do a get, you can, but just make sure you handle the error in a nice fashion. Okay, so we get our user now, and this is complaining because we have just a new line. Okay, so back inside our API, what we want to add is, we can make that call actually. We can say user equals services dot user email selector. We'll pass in the email. And then we'll say if user is none, so if the user does not exist based on that email, we want to raise an exception. So we'll do raise exceptions, authentication failed. We'll just say invalid credentials. We don't want to say that, the email is wrong or anything like that. Next, we want to do a check password. So we can do if not user.check password. We'll pass in the raw password as being password. We'll raise exceptions, authentication failed, invalid credentials. Okay, so in both cases, it will always be invalid credentials. This again, for security reasons, we don't want to tell the user that your email was wrong or their password was wrong. Specifically, we will just say in overall, it's just wrong if they enter the incorrect values for email and password. Okay, next, we want to go ahead and create a token out of this, and that will use the JWT library that we installed in the last video. So inside services, let's create a new function, and this will just be a create token. So we'll say create token. It will take in the user ID, which is an integer, and we'll just return a string. Okay, so the first thing is we need to create a payload, and that we can do by saying, should not pass, we'll say payload equals, and this will be a dictionary, the ID, which is user underscore ID. We also want an expiration, so we need to go ahead and import date time, and whilst we're here we can also import a few other classes. So we'll say import date time, this is not classes, sorry, libraries, and we also want the JWT, so import JWT, and hopefully that should be it for now. So we can go down and say datetime.datetime.utc now plus, and we'll say that this will be valid. The user will stay logged in for about 24 hours. So you can specify however long you want. I'm just going to give it a 24-hour duration. So this token will expire in 24 hours. And then IAT, we'll set that to datetime.datetime.utc now. So that's our payload. The next thing is that we want to encode it. So we'll say jwt.encode, pass in the payload. And we also need a JWT secret. So usually you would store that inside the settings.py file, or not the settings.py file, but inside the .env file. And in our case, we'll just keep it inside our settings file. So inside core, go ahead and open settings. And at the top, just where we have secret key, well, let's create our JWT secret. So we'll say JWT underscore secret. And add anything you want, make sure it's secure. Again, we wouldn't store this in here, we'd store this in a .env file or something like that. But we'll say subscribe to Rhythmic. And then back, we can just close this, and then back inside our services file, let's go ahead and import settings. So to do that, we just need to go ahead and say from django.conf import settings, and then down below we can say that the JWT secret is settings.jwt underscore secret, And we need to specify the algorithm, which is HS256. So that's now our token, and we can just return the token. Okay, so that's create token. Back inside our APIs file, in our login API, we can now go ahead and put, or get our token. So we can say token equals services dot create token, pass in the user ID, user dot ID. Next, we'll just create our response. So response equals, we'll say resp equals response dot response, and resp dot set cookie. We'll do key equals JWT. You can put the key as whatever you want. The value is going to be token, and we'll say HTTP only as true. And this HTTP only is important, so make sure you put that there. And then finally, we can just return our response. Cool, so that's our login API. Let's go ahead and test that out with a user that we already have. So go to login. Actually, first we need to register it in our URLs. So here we just need to say path login, and this is inside our users urls.py file, not the one in core. APIs dot login API as view, name equals login. And now let's go ahead and try it out. So if I remember correctly, I'm still logged in as the admin. So let me just sign out. So I'll just go to admin and just log out. Now if I go over to API, login, I can say that the email is john@gmail.com, and the password is, what was the password again? It was hello awesome world. If I post it, so everything worked out, status 200 okay. There's no response, as we now have in our application inside our, I think it's in here, in our cookies, sorry, we have this here, this JWT, and that's our authentication, which every time we make a request, this will be attached to our request, and based on this value, we will be able to know whether or not a user is authenticated. But there's no point me saying that if we can't see this. So let's go ahead and create another endpoint, and this will just be our user endpoint to just retrieve the user that's authenticated. So just below, let's create class. We'll say user API, and this will be views.api view, and authentication classes. We need to add this. We'll get to that in a second. Permission classes, we'll get to that as well. And this will just be a get a request. So user equals a request.user, and serializer will be serializer, user serializer, throw in the user, and it will just return response.response, so nothing fancy with this endpoint. Okay, so just a thing to keep in mind, this endpoint will can only be used if the user is authenticated. So we will not allow anyone to use this or call this endpoint if they are not authenticated. So how do we do that? Right now, there are no permissions. And in order to do that, we need to fill out both this authentication classes tuple along with our permissions classes. Now to do that, let's go ahead and create a new file inside our user, which we will call, let's just create it in a new file. We'll say this is called authentication. And inside that, this is where we'll create our own custom user authentication class. So we'll first import from Django.conf. You can, of course, write this inside the APIs file. Just for the sake of organization, I'm putting it here. Let's import settings. We also need from a REST framework, import authentication and exceptions. We need the JWT file library along with our user model. Okay, so let's say class custom user authentication. So Django does come, or Django REST framework does come with its own authentication classes. However, as we've done something quite specific in that we're storing it inside our cookies, from what I know, Django does not come with its own thing to verify that, so we have to build our own. But that's no trouble, so we'll say authentication, base authentication. So that's our parent class. We'll override this authenticate function here. We'll say token equals request.cookies.get. We'll say JWT. We don't want to do the square brackets because otherwise it will result in a hard fail, which we don't want in this case because the user may not actually be authenticated, and if that was the case, then this would fail. So we'll say if not token, we'll return none, and then we'll do a try, which is payload equals jwt.decode, and then the token itself, settings.jwt underscore secret, algorithms, and this has to be in a list, so make sure you bracket in the square brackets, HS256. Then let's put our accept, and we'll say raise exceptions, authentication failed, and we'll just say unauthorized, so something rather generic. And then user equals models.user.objects.filter, and we'll say ID equals payload, and in square brackets ID, and we'll say dot first. Finally, we can just return a tuple, so user and none. Okay, so what's happening is that in this authenticate, we override this function or this method called authenticate. We get the token from our cookies, so the one that you saw inside our application, so inside cookies, this guy here. So it'll get that. It will say if there is no token there, then return none, which means that the user is not authenticated. Then however, if it does exist, so it will just pass this, and then it will try to decode this token. If this works out well, then we can get the user and then return the user along with none. This tuple is required with the last element being none. I'm not 100% sure why. However, if this payload, if this token does not match up with this JWT secret and the algorithm, then it will result in an error, and we want to get that error and just raise authentication failed. So only if this is decoded successfully can we actually say that this user is authenticated. Okay, so back inside our APIs file, let's go ahead and import that. So say import authentication, and down below back in our user API, what we can say now is that for the authentication classes, we'll do authentication dot custom authentication, And remember to put a comma at the end of this. So otherwise it will just read it as a single object rather than inside a tuple. And then inside permissions, we'll do permissions, which we already imported here. So from REST framework, this permissions will be is authenticated. Okay, so let's go ahead and first actually register this before I forget. So inside the user.urls, we'll create a path. We'll just say this is called me, and apis dot user api dot as view name equals, let's say me. Okay, so let's hold our breath and try this out. So if we go to API/me, we get base permission class not iterable. And I think that is because, go back here, I didn't add a comma on permission classes. So again, this is the error. Now I've made it, but make sure you add a comma at the end of this tuple. Now if I refresh this, we get back the authenticated user. I'm authenticated as John, and I get back John Doe, all that. I can log out. However, I will, and then try it again without being authenticated, and you'll get an error. However, we don't have a logout endpoint, so let's go ahead and create one. Now for the last class in this tutorial, let's go ahead and say class logout API views.api view. We'll say authentication classes, which you don't want to access the logout API if you're not authenticated. It makes no sense. So we'll say authentication dot custom user authentication, comma, the permission classes, which will be again permissions dot is authenticated, comma. I've put this in square brackets. You can put it in a list if you want, but given that it's a fixed amount, it's just better practice to put it inside a tuple. And then say post request, and we'll say response or resp equals response dot response. We'll do response or resp dot delete cookie, and we want to delete the one that has the key JWT or whatever you named it. So this guy here. And then we'll say response resp dot data equals message. So long, farewell. And then finally, we'll just return resp. Okay, and then let's go to our URLs. Let's add our logout endpoint. So path logout apis dot logout api dot as view name equals logout. Now let's go ahead and try this out. So if I go now to logout, and this is, so endpoint is this. This is a post one. So if I go to logout and I click post, you can see over here that JWT is now gone. We've got message, so long, farewell. If I now go to the API me, we get authentication credentials were not provided. Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and log in. Let's log in with another user. So if I go to this data file, which I'm really glad I created, otherwise I'd be forgetting all of this. We want to just get rid of first name and last name. The email, we had Anne as our other one, ann@gmail.com, post. So we've logged in successfully. Let's go to me, and now you see your information. So ann@gmail.com. Okay, that's really it. Let's just log this user out just for the sake of it. So say log out and then post, so long, farewell. You can, of course, put the logout inside a get. However, just to maintain a bit more control and just more of a click of a button to know that we're logging out, I've put it inside a post. But that's really it for our user endpoint. So registering, logging in, seeing the user, their kind of like profile page as user API, and also logging out. That kind of covers the entirety of user authentication to registration. In the next video, we'll be like finishing this off by creating endpoints so that an authenticated user can use, such as creating objects, deleting them, updating them, and reading them. But that's it for this video. I hope you found value in it, and I hope to see you in the next one.